So moving on, I think this slide, for me, is one of the most important in this chapter. I think it's really important that you all, as new counselors and as new addictive use disorder counselors and professionals, that you help facilitate the change in and evolution in how we view and treat addictive use disorders and individuals with addictive use disorders. And so you can see here that we've stopped using, for the most part, the term addiction, like someone has an addiction or someone is an addict. And rather, we would say something like has an addictive use disorder or struggles with addictive use disorder. But certainly that term addict is going by the wayside, hopefully, and is quite outdated and is very labeling and places sort of blame and as if it's something that they can change. It's just a label, and so I think that it's really important. And you'll hear me, um, eh, eh, you'll hear me as we talk, and you'll hear me as we have lectures, that referring to someone as an addict is not something that I do regularly, and it's something that I'm very mindful to not do at all if I can help it. And I would like to challenge all of you guys to try not to do that as well. I think folks who struggle with addictive use disorders have enough shame and guilt associated with the outcome and consequences of their life having an addictive use disorder, the situations and circumstances that have happened to them prior to and because of having an addictive use disorder. I don't think they need one more uh, way to feel bad about themselves, and they certainly don't need one more person shaming them in that way. So, I wanted to make sure that I spent a little bit of time here and challenged you all to sort of think about the way that you speak with folks that you're going to be working with who do have addictive use disorders and who do struggle with something that is this complex and this complicated. And so, as you can see, and as we will discuss, because I want to compare and contrast, or not really, I want to complement this textbook with the DSM-5. You'll see that we now have substance-related disorders and certainly substance-induced disorders. And so there is definitely a progression or an evolution in the way that we're looking at this mental health issue. Um, and is it a disease? Is there a component of it that is somewhat disease-like? The jury's still out. But um, what we do know is that all substance-related disorders, and of course there's 10 classes, is that they share this common thread or this common experience, as your textbook says, that is rewarding. And again, those of you that had me in issues and addictions know this thought, but the reward can be negative in that the reward can be, I no longer have to feel horrible. So I am by using substances, I am rewarded because I don't have to feel bad, or I don't have to feel negative, or I don't have to think about these things that are so traumatizing or upsetting. If someone is, and we'll talk about self-medication here in a little bit, but if someone is self-medicating with substances, this would be a good example. So normally I feel filled with anxiety. If I were to self-medicate by use of substances, the reward is I don't feel that way anymore. And so that's really important. And it's an important thing to note that is such a reinforcer. And again, your book talks about this a lot in this chapter. And so I just really like this chapter. That such a strong reinforcer, such a strong drive to want to use to get this expected outcome is so powerful. It's so powerful, and as reinforcers typically are. And then this is how the DSM describes. It defines substance use disorders. This is, I believe, the exact language in the DSM-5. It looks very, yep, I'm pretty sure this is the exact language listed in the DSM-5 that they have here in this PowerPoint. And then, of course, substance-induced disorder. So the important distinction here, as opposed to a substance-related disorder, the substance-induced disorders are, this is important, reversible substance-specific syndrome due to a recent ingestion of a substance. It goes away. It's reversible. It goes away. It is reversible. This is really important. And then, of course, there's the specific criteria that go along with it. This is the criteria. Sorry, it cut off the top of it here. Let me see if I can move it up a little bit. So this is the specific criteria for alcohol use disorder. The criteria is, for the most part, the same for all substance use disorders, with the exception that the substance is different in the description. But what you can see is the taking something over large amounts of time than was originally, larger amounts or over longer periods of time than intended, persistent desire to cut back or control, great deal of time spent engaging in activities or trying to obtain the substance, craving, strong desire to use, of a failure to. So these next couple of ones are the impact it has on relationships and social settings and job and family. You can see that here. Social, occupational, recreational activities are given up. Engaging in use despite it being physically hazardous. And then 9, so you can see these are some physical, 8, 9, and 10 and 11, you get more into physical effects of use. So that's doing things that are physically hazardous, using despite knowing that it's got some physical or psychological issues that are being caused or exacerbated by it. Of course, tolerance, the need for more and more substances to get the same effect. So that's tolerance. And then, of course, using the same amount, you don't get the same, you get this diminished effect and continuing to use the same amount. This is what drives people to continue to use just to not be sick. They're no longer getting a high in many cases, but just using enough to not be sick. And then withdrawal can take physical or psychological or both, sort of mind of its own, and usually in these substances they're physical, but certainly, as we'll see later on in this chapter, it doesn't have to be. And the withdrawal, so this is important about withdrawal. Withdrawal is the opposite of the intended effect. So if you wanted, so speed, for instance, when you do anything that is gives you heightened energy, heightened awareness, heightened feelings, heightened emotions. The withdrawal is going to be the opposite of that. Anything that is numbing or slowing, the withdrawal is going to be the opposite of that. I like this section of your book as well, and I like this sort of statement: mere use of a drug is not a substance use disorder as long as the use does not lead to significant impairment. We need significant impairment. What significant impairment is can be somewhat subjective depending upon the person sitting across from you. So if the individual comes in and says, I'm drinking to the point that I'm not comfortable, and you can't really find where they fit into it being even mild in the DSM, it doesn't mean we don't talk to them. It doesn't mean that we don't consider their concern. And then certainly, of course, going further, it doesn't mean that just because they have this concern and it doesn't necessarily fit a criteria for an addictive use disorder doesn't mean that it can eventually become or evolve into something that's much more problematic. This goes without saying. There's not one single determining factor to demonstrate or pinpoint that someone has a substance use disorder. Just as there's no single one determining factor that can describe the etiology of addiction or how or why someone continues to use. These are your specifiers. I'm not going to go into that. We're going to have plenty of time to talk about specifiers. And then talks a little bit about behavioral addictions. And then gambling disorder. So we're not going to talk about this too much in this class, but gambling disorder is the only, right now, behavioral addiction that is listed in the DSM with a set of criteria. I envision that changing fairly soon. At least with the development of the new, the next DSM, I envision that changing. The World Health Organization, ICD-11, already has some other behavioral addictions or compulsive behaviors that fall very similarly in symptoms that look like addictive use disorders. And so, like I said, I envision the next DSM to look a little different. Gateway theory, if anybody was in middle school and did any sort of anti-drug awareness classes, then you know about gateway drugs, and usually they tell you that alcohol and marijuana are gateway drugs. And so there is a specific theory around that that may or may not fit with every individual that you sit across from. But it's essentially that, starting with a smaller drug progresses to a much larger use. And we've got some strong examples of how that was accurate, and then we certainly have a lot of strong examples of how this theory is not valid. Let's see. Pathological drug use. So here's another way of sort of describing it. I like this. I like this description. So the idea that there's this ever pressing, ever strong preoccupation with use. And then there's this sort of periods of using, and then oftentimes there's binging, and then you've got sort of withdrawal and negative effects. So I like this sort of the idea that there's this spiral here, that they all just compound to, again, that sort of perfect storm. And you can see the very end spiraling distress. So starting off mildly, and then it just escalates in a variety of different ways, in preoccupation and intolerance and using more and more and more. And then you get to a full-blown addictive use disorder. Here's this section talks about relapse. I'm not gonna. You can see here. This is a great chart. You can see here how, the color coded. I'm sorry, I have this. This got chopped off. I don't really know why this isn't taking the whole screen. I apologize for that. But you can see that in all of these instances that there is areas of gray. There's areas of abstinence. There's areas of occasional use followed by areas of abstinence. And that seems to be par for the course. This is about maturing out. We talked about that. Whether or not someone is able to be clean, be sober, be in recovery for long periods of time, we don't really know. We can't explain that by one factor. There's not willpower, there's not spirituality, there's not medicine, there's not one factor that can tell us that can explain recovery. That's pretty important. There's the schedule of classes. Route of administration. This is real important here. And I kind of touched on this a little bit, but oral or transdermal, so a patch on your skin that's slow absorption, IV and inhalation, the fastest, yields the most rapid drug entry into the brain, and the quickest you'll feel it. So that's why folks prefer, when they get to a sort of certain level in their use, if they're shooting intravenously, then that's sort of a preferred method for, let's say, heroin. They're going to get the drug faster, or in cases of like smoking crack, that's why people prefer to do that over maybe snorting cocaine. But yeah, you can see here that this is the fastest way to get to the effect. But the fast onset is associated with shorter duration. Again, going back to sort of the example of crack, it's, the high is minutes. So they keep doing it, keep doing it. Injecting, folks who inject, there's a shorter duration, so they have to maintain so they don't get sick, and so you always have to make sure that you have ample supply so you don't go through withdrawals. There's a lot here in this chapter, and coming up on now 30 minutes of lecture for you. So I'm not gonna continue to go on anymore. But pay attention to administration in this chapter.